so much for coming. This is a really important topic for us, an island community, and we have all been affected in different degrees by this problem over the last few years. So it affects tourism, it affects our family when they come down to visit, and just our general enjoyment of our beautiful beaches. So our favorite speaker is here to educate us, update us, let us know what's going on, right?
Yep.
And once again, it is with a lot of gratitude that I thank the foundation for their generous support of all the wonderful programs we are able to offer thanks to their generosity. So my heart is theirs, and I am always willing to lend a helping hand. So be generous to the Key Biscayne Community Foundation if you can.
Thank you, Roxy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm pretty certain I know everybody here, but just in case, if you don't know me, my name is Rumya. I am the Director of Environmental Science for the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. I run their citizen science program. Normally, when we have lunch and learns, I have a guest speaker. The last 2 months has been me because I'm too busy to find a guest speaker, so it's just easier to just do it myself. We're going to talk about sargassum today. I know there's a turtle on the front, but that's just because I put turtles in everything. But the turtles are very relevant when it comes to sargassum. We'll talk about that. Sargassum. So what is the whole story of sargassum? This is what we're going to cover. Just what is it at all? Is it seaweed? Is it algae? Is it seagrass? You know, where it's found, how it is actually a floating ecosystem, the types of animals that live in it, what the Sargasso Sea is. And then we're going to talk about the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, which is kind of a new thing, and that's kind of where the problems are arising. And then we're going to talk about why the sargassum is overgrowing so much, what's causing that, the ecological impact of that. I'm not going to go into all of the human and financial and all that impact, because then I'd be here for 3 weeks. But we're just going to talk about the environment today. But if you have questions about that, I can try to answer those. And then what can be done or what is being done. What is sargassum? It has been described as an oasis in a desert. It is a floating macroalgae. A lot of people call it seaweeds kind of synonymously, but it is actually a type of algae. It's named by Portuguese sailors who called it sargasso, which is the same name as a type of flower that grows in their water wells back home. They thought it looked like that. I looked that flower up and it looks nothing like this, so I don't know if that story is true. It is free-floating and planktonic, which basically means it is suspended in the water. It's not connected to anything. And these little berry-like attachments, those are actually air sacs that help it stay afloat. There are 2 species in particular that we're going to talk about. I'm not going to keep naming them, but that's when I say sargassum, I'm really just talking about these 2 species. And that's Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans. Those are the 2 that are holopelagic, which means that it lives, reproduces entirely floating, not attached to anything. The vegetative reproduction, which I mentioned right here, it reproduces vegetatively. That basically means that it reproduces by just breaking off into pieces and growing new plants from those pieces. It doesn't have seeds, it doesn't have flowers, it doesn't reproduce the same way that normal plants that you find on land reproduce. It can probably, but it doesn't generally. And it's never attached to anything, it's always floating. I mean, obviously it will wash up on shore, but then it dies. It's not meant to live attached to anything. There are a lot of other species of sargassum that do attach to things and grow, you know, like seaweed and whatever. And they're not the ones that we're really concerned about. But just so you know, there are other types of sargassum, but it's just these 2 that are the free-floating ones that we find at the Atlantic, you know, wreaking havoc.
Is this what they ate when they were stranded on a boat after it sank?
I don't know. It is actually, it can be edible. It's probably not a good idea because it's also very good at pulling in heavy metals from its environment. So you'd be eating a lot of arsenic if you ate it. But in theory, it's edible. But whether or not, people have eaten that when they get shipwrecked or something, I'm not really sure. So why is it important? Sargassum has always been a part of the ecology of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not anything new just because we're seeing a lot of it now. It's always kind of been there. And it is actually a very important part of that environment. It's found generally in the tropical oceans, so warmer waters. You're not going to find it near the poles or even in the areas like, too far south or too far north, even if you haven't reached the poles. It's going to be closer to the equator in the tropics. It creates a very interesting, different, unique ecosystem that you don't usually see. So what it does is it provides habitat for a lot, dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of marine animals. It's basically a three-dimensional habitat. So you have, it floats in these huge mats on the water. Like, it almost looks solid. And small animals, especially birds, can actually walk on top of it when it's dense enough. So you have that above the water, and you will have birds that will actually hang out there. They will eat little critters that they find in there, and this can be out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And then you have the little critters themselves that live in the actual leaves and the stems and the tangles of the sargassum. So they'll be found from all the way from the surface down to however deep the sargassum goes. And then underneath the sargassum, it basically kind of creates a canopy under which a lot of fish and other types of marine animals will feel safe. It's like a shelter. And so you'll see, if you go underneath and look under a sargassum mat, tons of fish just swimming around underneath it. It also acts as a nursery ground for a lot of animals. There are tons of fish that, especially commercially important fish like mahi-mahi, you'll find baby, like juvenile mahi-mahi that are hanging out underneath the mats or within the mats. It's a safe haven for them. They can hide from predators inside the mats, in the tangles, things like that. And sea turtles also. Baby sea turtles specifically leave here and swim out to the sargassum in the Sargasso Sea. It's a food source. The seaweed itself, as I mentioned, is edible. Probably not a good idea though. It does have arsenic and other heavy metals in it. But it supports a very complex food web within the floating mats. So as I mentioned, you have these little critters. You'll have like tiny little shrimp and tiny little invertebrates that kind of live and swim among the branches and everything. And then you have the larger animals like the birds and the sea turtles and the fish that are eating those. And then you also will have even larger fish that are trying to prey on anybody that happens to stray a little bit too far from the mat. And in that way, you have this, constantly changing shape, changing depth, moving ecosystem that supports quite a lot of animals. I'm just going to show you some pictures of the animals that live in there because they're really cute and I like them. This is a sargassum shrimp, not a mangrove shrimp. And obviously you can tell it has evolved to live in sargassum. It looks exactly like that leaf that it's sitting on. And that is the case for a lot of these little critters that live in sargassum. And there are quite a few of these you will not find anywhere else except out in the middle of the ocean in a mat of sargassum. It's hard to tell, but both of these are sea slugs that specifically only live in sargassum. As you can tell, they match perfectly. And they are some kind of sargassum sea slug that you will only find there. And the thing is, you might even pick up a clump of sargassum that is washed ashore, and that, assuming it's fresh, you can look at it, and there may be a sargassum sea slug in there, and you just won't even notice. They blend in perfectly. Sargassum crabs. Again, all of these animals that live in the sargassum have evolved to look exactly like sargassum. This one's a little bit lighter. This one's a little more darker orange. These are crabs that never see a hard surface. They just live out in the middle of the ocean, but they hide in the sargassum. This is some kind of triggerfish. I forgot the name of it. But again, this type of fish will not live its entire life in the Sargassum, but this is clearly a juvenile. It's very, very small, and it will live a good portion of its juvenile life in the Sargassum where it's safe, as many, many other fish do. This is probably my favorite fish. That is a Sargassum frogfish. And if you get lucky, you can actually find them in the clumps of Sargassum that you find out in the water here in Key Biscayne. A friend of mine was working with summer camp kids a year or two ago, and they were out like grabbing clumps of Sargassum, putting them in tanks and looking to see what kinds of critters they found. And at one point they did actually find a Sargassum frogfish, which was really exciting, and I was really jealous. So this is one. This one's a very dark red one. They can be very orange. And they can actually get quite large, but they're really cool looking, and they actually just look like Sargassum that has come to life. And as I mentioned, baby sea turtles. So the interesting thing about sea turtles is that somehow they have the innate just instinct when they're born to make a run for the ocean and just swim out to sea, to the Sargasso Sea. And for a long time, we had no idea what baby sea turtles did when they got to the ocean, other than get eaten by literally everything. They went to the ocean and they disappeared. And then, 20, 30, 40 years later, you see a turtle come up on the beach where it was born and lay eggs. And, so they called these years, the juvenile years, the lost years. And they finally started doing more like trying to follow them, putting satellite tags on them, which is really difficult because they're so small. And you also don't want to weigh it down because it's going to get eaten by something. But eventually they found out that they get out to like the major currents in the Atlantic Ocean, like the jet stream and other currents. And those currents help them take them straight to the Sargasso Sea. And then that's where they spend years growing for a long time. Eating the fish, eating the sargassum, eating the little invertebrates that live there. And it's safe for them. They can hide, they can climb around in it. And so that's what they do. So it's the journey there that's very, very dangerous. When they're there, they are quite a bit more safe. Not entirely, it's not like they can't get caught there, but they are a lot more safe once they're there. But the journey there, and then once they leave, of course, then they're in the open ocean. There's other things that can get them again. But that's what we found out. The lost years are the Sargasso Sea years, apparently. And they're just really cute. I always have to put in turtles because they're cute. So, what is the Sargasso Sea? The Sargasso Sea is a really weird sort of phenomenon that happens in the Atlantic Ocean. It's not a sea as you would normally define a sea. Like, the Gulf of Mexico is like a sea. It's enclosed by land barriers. What's interesting about the Sargasso Sea is that it has no barriers. It is literally just an area off the coast of the United States. And it is, you can't obviously see it on this picture, but like tons and tons and tons of mats of sargassum just floating around in there. And then occasionally, they kind of escape and like come down here and like, will follow some other current. But for the most part, that's where the majority of the sargassum used to grow. And that's where it came from. That was kind of the source. It is about 2 million square miles, the area. And it's not entirely one giant mat of sargassum. There's like clumps kind of, spread out. But it's all within that same kind of circular area. And as I mentioned, it's unique in that it doesn't have borders. It is entirely enclosed by ocean currents that move in this kind of circular pattern. And they just hold the sargassum there. A lot of these animals, as I mentioned, never see a hard surface in their life. They just live out in the Sargasso Sea, never feel the bottom of the ocean, never feel a beach, nothing. They just are out floating around. So that's kind of the motion of the currents that encase it. This is a little bit exaggerated. It's not quite that big. It's more like that big. But that's the general direction of the currents. And they move, constantly in this kind of circular pattern. And the middle becomes a little bit of a dead zone. And that's where the sargassum just accumulates and, reproduces there. And as I mentioned, occasionally pieces will kind of escape from this gyre and come out and float around and go to other places. But that's normal. That's what's supposed to happen. Sargassum washing up on the beach is a very normal thing to happen. It's just the amounts that we've been seeing that's not normal. So this is, as I mentioned, the Sargasso Sea, the currents. This is where you would normally find the sargassum. That you do have sargassum that will live kind of in other places, but not to the same degree, not to the same amount that you would find in the Sargasso Sea. That was kind of the main source of sargassum. What we've been seeing recently is that this little, not really circular, I guess oblong area of currents, where you have currents moving this way and then currents moving back that way, the north equatorial circulation area or region, we've been starting to see sargassum growing there. And that is, again, seeing it there isn't weird, but the sheer amount that's growing there is what is abnormal. So that brings us to the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. The belt itself is right here within that area. So in 2011 is when we first noticed that this was becoming a weird problem. Researchers have been looking at macroalgae blooms in the oceans for a long time using satellites. And what they noticed in 2011 was a huge increase in the amount of sargassum that they were seeing in the Atlantic Ocean. And then by 2015, that sargassum had gotten to the point where it was now being a problem, washing up on beaches, and not just in clumps that you could deal with. Were 2 or 3 feet deep clumps of sargassum, which was very much out of the ordinary. And by 2018, it started becoming economically difficult for countries in the Caribbean, a lot of cities and counties in Florida, to deal with the amount of sargassum that they were seeing. The satellite imagery at that point showed sargassum blooms stretching 5,500 miles from the west coast of Africa all the way into the Gulf of Mexico. So, as you saw, if you remember from that map, the Sargasso Sea is a little circular region off the east coast of the United States. And now they're seeing all the way from the western coast of Africa, a belt going into the Gulf of Mexico. And they have been obviously observing this for 8 years, but all they're seeing is this really weird pattern of every year when it's sargassum season, it's just becoming more and more. And they've looked into this, what causes it. There are obviously natural things that happen that help it to grow. That has those have always been there, and that is part of its natural life cycle. But now they've also found that there are a lot of unnatural things that have been contributing to it. So first, the natural factors. In the winter, you have the currents from the Atlantic create an upwelling off of the western coast of Africa. And what that means is that the currents in the Atlantic are moving from Africa, and they're heading west towards South America. And so when you have huge volumes of water moving in one direction, you need more water to replace the water that's been displaced. So what happens is water from the deep ocean then comes up along the side of Africa to replace this water that's now moved over. And that upwelling brings a lot of nutrients and a lot of different things that then feeds the sargassum. It's a natural occurrence that's always happened for millennia. The other thing is the Amazon River, which dumps also into the other side of the Atlantic from South America. You get nutrients and runoff from the rainforest that, again, is a natural phenomenon. And those nutrients have always fed, the sargassum and whatever else is in the water there. Those are the natural factors that have always been feeding just the natural life cycle of sargassum, among other things. Now, what's happening that is unnatural is we humans, have helped to create this very complex feedback loop that is creating a larger and larger and larger problem over time as it continues to loop. And what that is, first of all, there's increased nutrient runoff and discharge from the Amazon. And that is because of industrial areas that are using fertilizers and other nutrients that is then, flushed into the Amazon, and now that's increased the amount of nutrients that goes into the ocean. But also logging in the Amazon loosens the nutrients in the soil because the tree roots themselves hold a lot of those nutrients in place. So without the trees there to hold it, those are then also, as it rains, washed into the Amazon and then out into the ocean. So because of a lot of our actions, we have increased the amount of nutrients from the Amazon River by an enormous amount. I don't have a number for that, but it's big. In 2019, a study showed that aerosolized phosphorus coming from Africa is also adding to the nutrients in the Amazon. And I'll explain that a little bit better. I have a map right after this that kind of explains what's going on. African dust that moves from the Sahara to the this hemisphere, like to the Amazon and the northern hemisphere, has always also been a very natural phenomenon that happens. It brings nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients with it. That dust movement, which is normal, has also changed and now is also combined with smoke and other things coming from various places in Africa, bringing more phosphorus with it. So what we basically have, you have the two natural areas of nutrients that feed the sargassum. You have the nutrients coming from the Amazon River being dumped into the Atlantic here, and you have the upwelling off the west coast of Africa. Those are normal, those have always been there. But now, you have extra nutrients coming from the Amazon River, as I said, because of fertilizer use and logging in the Amazon that is increasing that. You have the normal Sahara dust that comes over, it brings nutrients with it, and that kind of settles over here, not just in the Amazon, but it does actually feed the Amazon, but it's kind of everywhere. You may have seen in the news recently that there was a huge dust cloud coming our way, and it made the sunsets slightly more orange or something. But that is actually a natural phenomenon, it just happened to be a little bit more this year. So you have that coming, bringing nutrients with it. But then along with that, now you have all these fires that are being set in different places throughout Africa that is adding to these aerosolized nutrients. And that's because of land clearing, the kind of slash and burn technique where they just cut everything down and burn it, and then you have clear land and you can build on top of it. There's a lot of that type of industry going on, and that is adding quite a lot of, not just phosphorus and stuff, but carbon and other things into the atmosphere. All of this ends up creating this weird loop that is ultimately just adding tons and tons of fertilizer, basically, into the Atlantic Ocean that is feeding sargassum. So what you're seeing, this is July 2011. This is a satellite image, or well, a computer satellite image. These little specks here that are like green and red and yellow, that's the sargassum belt that is forming in 2011. That already was when they noticed it, because that was like way more than it should have been. And they're like, oh, that's weird. This year there's so much sargassum that's kind of stretching from right there. And so they're just keeping an eye on it because they're like, maybe it's just a weird year. July 2012, it's about the same size, but you'll notice a lot more red, and that means it's a lot more dense. So there's more sargassum actually. We actually don't have any data for 2013, I don't know why. 2014, much bigger. It's spread out, more red, farther up towards the Gulf, and then you also see some up here in the Gulf already. 2015, it's just out of control, just everywhere, the whole area. 2016, it went down a little bit, so we're like, oh, good news, maybe it's getting better. And then 2017, 2018, it was like, oh, just kidding, it's actually worse. And I don't have the satellite images past 2018. Most of the studies that have done showed 2018 as like the peak. It hasn't gotten a lot better, but it is less than 2018. But this year in particular is supposed to be one of the worst years. I don't know if it's the worst, but it's not a good one. But you can see the trend, how each year it kind of steadily got worse and worse. And the reason we look at July is because that is peak sargassum season. If you look at these same images in December, you won't even really see anything. All the sargassum will be gone. So it grows that quickly in a season, depending on how much nutrients it gets. So, what can be done? That is the million-dollar question. Locally, for a while, we had the solution of burying it in the sand. That comes with its own problems. Namely, when sargassum is out in the sun, it does actually degrade, it dries out and degrades quite quickly. When you bury it, it stays moist and it stays warm, and that then can become a breeding ground for bacteria. There was some speculation, they did some studies, I don't know what the conclusion was, but a professor at the University of Miami was looking into the high bacterial counts that we were getting for a few years here, if that was tied to the fact that we were burying our sargassum and it was breeding bacteria that was then washed back into the water. I don't know that that's the case, but that is a possibility. And they did find very high bacterial counts in this buried sargassum. And when I say bacteria, I'm talking about, in particular, E. coli. Composting it is difficult, not because you can't compost it, but you can't use the compost very well or very easily because it has a very high salt content. So if you try to give that to your plants, you're going to salt the earth, literally. And as I mentioned earlier, arsenic. It's very good at pulling heavy metals out of its environment. And so you tend to have a very high heavy metal concentration in sargassum. Not always, but most of the time, just because it is very efficient at pulling out these heavy metals. But because of that, when you compost it, you can't then use that because now you're introducing, arsenic and other heavy metals into the environment. As I mentioned, it does dry out quickly and it does decompose quickly if left in the sun. So when we were doing the burying of the sargassum on Key Biscayne Beach, in bill bags, they just leave it. They don't do anything to it. And even when it was like a few feet deep, it still actually kind of didn't last very long. It was usually gone within a week, or at least mostly gone, to the point where you're not like sinking up to your knees in it. But the bigger issue is that the sargassum overgrowth is a global issue. So it's not like we can just make some change here at home that's going to fix it. It's what's happening in the Amazon, it's what's happening in the whole basically continent of Africa, and then with warmer ocean temperatures are also helping to feed that belt. Because as I mentioned, it used to only be in the Sargasso Sea in the tropics, for the most part. That's where you'd find the majority of it. But now, because ocean temperatures are changing and the change in temperature is also affecting the strength and direction of a lot of the currents. Now, that's why the sargassum is escaping more easily, but also it's able to grow in the equatorial region more than it used to. So what can be done? I don't know. Unfortunately, I usually like to end my lectures on like, oh, this is what you can do and it's going to be fine and we'll figure it out. And I don't have that for this one, but I do have a video that's about 10 minutes and they talk about some very interesting ideas that some of these researchers are working on. So I thought it was better if they just explain what they're doing.
The Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt is the largest seaweed bloom in the world, and it's expanding. With the satellite data, scientists were able to hazard an estimate of its size.
There's just several isolated research groups. I just think that things would move a lot faster if everyone could work together.
There are some people that have some pretty great ideas. It would be better if a lot of these researchers were working together on a larger scale solution or a combination solution instead of each one kind of working in silos. That is something that tends to happen a lot, which is unfortunate, but there are a lot of ideas out there. She did mention one of her colleagues was working on creating bricks out of sargassum, and I have actually read quite a bit about that, and they do something, they create these bricks in a way that they theoretically are biodegradable, but they won't just your house won't randomly biodegrade if it's made out of sargassum bricks. You can build with them. It is very, very sturdy and it holds together. But you can also, at some point, if you're rebuilding or you need to change something or the house falls into disrepair and is abandoned or whatever, you can then break them apart and it can be degraded. I'm not describing it as well as I should be. I don't remember the paper that well, but it was a really, really interesting concept. And And it seemed to be working. They had actually started creating these bricks. So that is the presentation. I do want to say, she mentioned that the sea turtles seem to have trouble, the baby sea turtles had trouble getting out to the water. There's two things about that. What I've seen is that as long as the turtles can get out of their nest, they are surprisingly resilient. And they climb, and they'll go. This is a video that I took at Bill Baggs. And they'll go for it. They can, you'd be surprised. He was fine. The bigger problem is if you have a nest that's ready to hatch and a huge clump of sargassum comes ashore and covers it. Because then they can't get out of the nest, and that's a bigger issue. If they can get out of the nest, they can usually climb over the sargassum. I mean, if it's like 12 feet tall, probably not, and that was actually an issue in 2018 in some places in the Caribbean. But that wasn't like the most common problem. The other issue with sea turtles, though, is that when the babies get out into the water, I mentioned, they get into the currents and they try to head to the Sargasso Sea. But if they get out into the water and they run into a clump of sargassum that's, 100, 200 yards offshore, they may get confused and be like, oh, I'm in the Sargasso Sea. And they don't keep going, they stay there. And then in a day or two, that clump washes ashore, and now this baby turtle has come back to shore and is probably disoriented, may end up dying because now all the sargassum is dying, all of his food source is dying, unless he's able to get back out into the water and go the right way. So that's actually the bigger issue, not so much them climbing over it, but getting out from under it, and then also making their way past it to the actual Sargasso Sea. That is what I have for you today. I can answer questions. Thank you. It's another video I'm just going to play while I'm asking or answering questions. That's a good question. There's, probably there is small amounts of arsenic just in the ocean. That's natural to some extent, and it's just very, very good at pulling that out. But you are probably also having that from various types of pollution that gets into the water, like from the flushing out of the Amazon, or from these fires and dust and things coming out of Africa and heading over. That's going to have more than just phosphorus in it or nitrogen in it. There's going to be a lot more other types of pollutants, and so that's probably a very likely source. But I couldn't say for sure. That's just my guess. No, it's not likely. There have been some reports of people feeling a little bit of irritation if they swim through it, or if it's decaying, and in some places it has been known to sort of decay and give off some kind of gas as it's decaying. But that's only if it's in huge, huge amounts. I mean, it gives off the gas no matter what, but usually it's not really going to hurt anything. But if you have, literal tons of sargassum all decaying at the same time, it's going to stink. And it does give off a gas that in large amounts could cause irritation. But there's nothing in it that's particularly poisonous that's going to kill you or really hurt you that bad. The worst is maybe, as I mentioned, swimming through it sometimes has caused some people irritation. I have swam through a huge patch of sargassum, and it didn't bother me. It tickled, but it didn't cause me any problems. I have no idea, actually. I don't know why it's so good. It's because it's not just arsenic. They just bring up arsenic because that's the one that seems to be the biggest issue. But it is just, in general, very good at pulling heavy metals. And why it's good at that, I couldn't tell you. But it may be some kind of defense mechanism from being eaten. A lot of plants will do that, where they soak up whatever kind of toxins they can, so that they can't, not just plants, but animals will do that too. So it might be something like that, but I'm not really certain. Yeah.
Does the Pacific and Indian Oceans have a comparable growth?
Not that I'm aware of. They do have species of sargassum, but I don't believe that they have the floating sargassum, the natans and the flutons. I think that is specific to the Atlantic. There probably are some kind of floating seaweeds, but they don't seem to have the issue of like this, where it's just growing out of control and clogging up beaches and everything. Yes?
When it sits on the beach, it actually disappears rather quickly. So
Generally speaking, yes, as long as it's very, it's sunny and it's hot, it does degrade quite quickly.
Okay, so it degrades, it just goes away, doesn't go back into the water.
I mean, generally, it depends on the situation. I mean, if you're gonna have like, 3 feet deep
Right.
sargassum, probably some of that is gonna end up being, going back out and coming back in, just depending on the tides. But yeah, for the most part, if it's just staying there, it will degrade eventually. Even just this season, at the beginning of turtle season, the north end of Bill Bags had sargassum that was in certain areas anywhere from like a few inches to about 2 feet deep. One of our rangers actually got her vehicle stuck. We were laughing at her. She got pulled out by the beach raker from the Key Biscayne beach because he saw her. But all of that sargassum, it's, you can still see it on the beach because it still comes up, but it's not anywhere that deep anymore. And we can drive over it without worry of being stuck, and that was just in a matter of a few weeks, it became manageable.
So is it gotten worse and you can't use that anymore? Because we did it for like 20, 30 years.
Both I mentioned and they mentioned in the video, they are finding like high amounts of arsenic and other heavy metals, but arsenic is the biggest one that they're finding, and that's why they can't use it a lot of times as compost.
Just because they're doing more construction in the Amazon and it's creating more.
Yeah, I mean, the source I'm not entirely sure of, but I imagine it's coming from various places, like the industry that, you have all the nutrients and crap like coming in, being flushed into the Amazon River and then out into the water. But then you also have all of the burning and, construction and things happening in Africa that's also adding to the dust and everything that naturally comes over. And, if you're burning stuff, there's going to be a lot of gross stuff in there. So it's possible that that's another source. And there may just be some other source for arsenic. I don't honestly know. But those two seem like, likely culprits for at least some of it. Not likely, no, because they're not really eating the sargassum. They're eating the little critters that live within the sargassum. So for them, any amount of arsenic that might kind of be involved in that food web is minimal. And by the time you're eating a fish, it's negligible at that point. So you're not really in any danger, not for that, no. I think you'd have to like literally just eat the sargassum to really make it have any kind of effect.
Does it die
Yeah.
on its own? Like, does it die in the ocean, or does it only dies when it comes to shore and gets
It probably dies on its own. Must at some point because it blooms in the summer. And so when the water changes, the temperature changes, it dies off in the winter, so then you don't have any sargassum. So, because yeah, all of these giant blooms that we're seeing are specifically in the summer. So during the winter months, you have very minimal sargassum. You just need enough of it there in the summer for it to explode because it's getting all the nutrients.
Who removed it? Because you said it's a season problem, but in the time that they die, how did you clear out the water? Did they do?
The water clears itself. It dies and sinks in the water. That's a natural.
Go to the end.
Yeah, that's just it degrades and it biodegrades as it's dying in the water. Yeah, that's just the natural cycle.
Would similar studies of other seaweeds show the same patterns in climate change?
It's hard to say because the reason that this sargassum in particular is able to be tracked by satellite is because it's pelagic and it floats and it blooms out in the ocean. You don't really have other types of seaweed that are floating around like that and growing into these huge mats that you can track by satellite. Most of them are attached in a certain place. So I haven't seen anything. Most of the satellite images, if you're looking at like blooms, they're looking at specifically sargassum or blue-green algae. That's the other one that you would see that does get huge blooms due to incoming nutrients.
Those are the ones the west coast of Florida has a problem a few years ago. The water became green, problem with the oxygen, fish dying. You remember that was?
So, I mean, there's a few different things that have happened off the coast of Florida. We do get blue-green algae blooms, and that is a huge problem. That, as the blue-green algae dies, it sucks all of the oxygen out of the water, and then you end up with these you end up with anoxic regions, which is basically whole areas without oxygen. So if a fish swims into that, it suffocates. We also have red tide, which happens mostly off the Gulf Coast of Florida. Both of these have been fed by extra nutrients which are released into the water, both from releases from Lake Okeechobee, but also some industrial activity that has loosened or flushed out phosphorus and nitrogen from natural deposits in different places in Florida. So again, it's the nutrients that we're causing to go into the water, but that is what's feeding both of those.
The capital, they are pouring everything under the sun. And you don't see it and you don't smell it. But you mentioned the growth of bacteria that happen in that case also to the water.
So before they were just mixing it into the sand and burying it. Now I think they do that still somewhat, but they also remove quite a lot of it and it goes to the landfill.
Not here in Key Biscayne.
Some of it is, because I've seen the trucks carting it away. But yeah, so it's a combination that they're doing now because just incorporating into the sand was only kind of working as far as like making it less gross on the beach. But then they did the study that showed that they were finding E. coli and things growing in it. So I think that's why they made the change. So it's partially incorporated and then partially carted out to
Why
the.
E. coli is a fecal bacteria?
I mean, it exists naturally anyway. Yeah, it does, but it just so happens that it's like a good petri dish for it to start growing. And that's not the only one. That's just the one that we would be more worried about. Yeah.
We read that the Saharan dust helps depress hurricane formation. Does a mat of this also maybe cool the water down at all?
Actually, one of the studies that I read is that they are concerned that really thick mats of sargassum becomes too warm. And while it may not be too warm, what I remember reading is that while it may not be too warm for like the threshold of a baby turtle, it might be too warm for the invertebrates that the turtle feeds on. And so that could actually cause problems if it becomes too warm for their food source, and then they end up having nothing to eat. So it actually works more as an insulator. The other issue you have when you have these huge mats that float ashore is that when they're in the process of floating ashore and they kind of still extend out several meters into the water, if they're very, very thick, they are blocking the sunlight from all that nearshore habitat. So then you have these seagrasses that grow along the shore that are not getting sunlight, they're not able to photosynthesize. And it can also have that effect where it's killing off the natural seagrasses and things like that, which then ultimately will change the actual landscape of or the seascape, I should say, of that area. And then you're kind of changing the entire environment. And that includes the plants and the animals and everything that would normally live there.
A couple of years ago, we were in Mexico, in Playa del Carmen, and they had a huge mass of and they were concerned with, they were not allowed, nobody was allowed to get into the beach because of stingrays. Is that a problem in Florida?
That's always a danger. They hide really well, so you could always step on them by accident and get stung. It would be harder if you can't see the ground at all because there's a huge mat of sargassum. It's possible that in that area they have a higher population of stingrays, but I wouldn't say it's not. It's not a problem, but it's not something that couldn't happen here. It could, but it's just not likely. Yes? Sea lice? Not that I'm aware of, not in any significant way. There might be something similar to sea lice that live, again, as like the invertebrates, there's all kinds of little critters and things that live in the sargassum. So it's possible, but nothing specifically that I've ever read that talked about any connection.
So when the year recycle at winter time, a lot of the sargassum out in the ocean, it goes away.
Yes, it dies off.
So the lucky little sea turtles that made it out there,
Well, so it depends. It's not that it all goes away, but these huge blooms that are around the equator, they die back. So you still have sargassum living in the warmer waters of the tropics, especially in the Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea doesn't disappear, so you still will have sargassum there, but not, it's like the ice caps. In the winter they grow, and then in the summer they recede. It's more like that. They don't actually go away, it just becomes bigger and smaller. The bigger issue with the sargassum is that it's now in the summer growing in that equatorial region, that it didn't used to bloom like that, like it is now. That's like, not that it doesn't grow there, but small amounts of it is normal, but now we're having these huge, huge blooms. And so that will probably mostly die off because it's not actually natural for it to be there. And the temperature change is probably more drastic. But in the summer, once you get back to that like perfect storm of all the things going on and you get bits of sargassum getting into that area, they just start proliferating like crazy. All right, thank you guys very much.